New Buddha-ware Dhamma Talks. Jeff Hunt presents a talk on some aspect of the Buddha's teaching.
Now, resilience, what is it driving at if you look at different contexts in which it's used? And I came up with 3 different dimensions, basically flexibility, endurance, and balance. So flexibility is perhaps lowering one's expectations, or at least knowing that you have an expectation. Because we all have expectations, and life can't go on without expectations. But knowing that you have an expectation is on a different plane from having an expectation. You can have an expectation, not really be aware that you have one, and then of course when what you expect doesn't turn out, it could be quite painful, frustrating, disappointing, depending on how important that expectation is. Because so often our anger or our frustration is due not to what we think it's due, which is something outside then happening or not happening, but to my expectation about how things should be. So if I didn't have the expectation, things might be different. But you see, so often, because our minds are directed outwards, we have certain expectations without really being aware of them, and then when things don't turn out in a certain way, we become angry because we feel that they ought to. So then we may, for example, start blaming someone or blaming something, and there's a whole range of things that we can blame out there, from global organizations like banks, which has been a favorite one recently, or the neighbor. So we're quite good at projecting. What we don't do is think, well, yes, but actually it's something that I'm carrying. It's an expectation of mine that is not being met. So I am the one clinging to a future-orientated activity or event, which for some reason I think is to my benefit. And nobody's saying there's anything wrong with that. It's very human. We can't really escape it. But to be aware of it puts you on a different level. What happens, of course, when there is lack of resilience is, for example, disappointment. And disappointment can be catastrophic. Let's face it, people lose their lives because of deep disappointment. But just look at the inner logic of it. The disappointment depends on an expectation, right? Something perhaps one is taking for granted, or one thinks is permanent or immovable, and then it proves not to be. And that's like tearing away at one's identity, in a sense. One's vision of life, or how things ought to be, one's vision of one's happiness. So it's suffering. It's extremely painful, to say the least. Now, resilience is not being hit so hard by those things. We're all human, and we will be hit, and we will be hit hard. However, there can be a margin of flexibility in which you're not knocked out. Of course, everything depends on conditions. We've seen, for example, in Nepal recently, some individuals losing just about everything. So they've lost maybe their entire family, their children, their home, their livelihood, maybe their own health. They're just left there with nothing, in a pile of rocks. Now, where does resilience make any sense with that? Because that's like the ultimate, isn't it, really? Or if one finds that one has a life-threatening illness, which changes the whole direction of one's life. Well, with something like what happened in Nepal, community is very important. Now, in the West, we tend to be very individualistic. So when we speak of resilience, we're thinking of my resilience. But what about our resilience? Our resilience. Our resilience is about how we help each other and understand each other, support each other, have compassion for each other when things go collectively wrong. Because things don't go wrong just for me, things go wrong for us as a community, whatever, society. And it may be then that individual resilience isn't enough. Now, we have seen, even in this country, during some serious floods, suddenly people started to become much more community-oriented, where they will start not just dealing with their sandbags. I don't know whether you ever handle a sandbag, it's pretty heavy. But handling other people's sandbags, because we're all in the same boat, or lack of a boat, it can only be done together. So then you can talk about community resilience. Now, what about endurance? Another old-fashioned word, which I like a lot, is fortitude. You don't hear that very often now, do you, fortitude? See, here we are so spoilt, aren't we? Here in Guildford we have water every time you turn a tap. Isn't that wonderful? Take it for granted. Imagine you go and turn the tap and nothing comes out. And then nothing comes out the following day or the following day. Right? Are you going to endure? What are you going to do? Or will you throw a wobbly and start blaming the water company? So you might have to contact the water company, but at the same time, we're taking a lot for granted. I lived in Africa for 12 years, and very often the water was off. But not only was the water off, you didn't know when it was coming back. So it could be off for 30 minutes, but it could be off for 30 days. But if it went off, you didn't know whether it was going to come back or not. So what does that mean? You had to be prepared. So you hope for the best, water's there, but you're prepared for the worst. So we had a colossal tank outside the house which trapped the rainwater, and it was always there. Of course it could get stagnant, which then presented other dangers, and so you had to boil the water, and then I wouldn't say it tasted particularly good either. But boiled stagnant water is actually the lot of most people on this planet. That is actually what they drink, right? But we in Guildford, we don't have to endure in that way, because we're doing the opposite. What's the opposite of endurance? I don't know. Taking comfort for granted. Is there a word for that? What would that be? Being spoiled, I suppose. Can anybody think of another word for it?
Indulgence.
Indulgence, yeah, kind of an unwitting indulgence. We don't feel we're being indulgent. And the same with electricity. When I lived in Nigeria, the electricity was just totally erratic. It never made any sense. On, off. Could be on for a week, and you think, oh, they've really fixed the power station now. We're going to get good electricity. The moment you had that thought is the moment the electricity went off. So we were always prepared. So we had kerosene lamps as well. How prepared are we, really, as individuals in life? How far can we endure? We've seen people with flooded houses. Having a flooded home is not a question of just having some water on your carpet, like when you've spilled a drink. It's having sewage on your carpet. Everything backs up through the drains. You've got sewage in your house. The stench is unbearable. Everything's been ruined. Now, you can just sob and sob and sob as much as you like, but it's not going to get things done, is it? You're then expected to be, or perhaps you would, wonder about how resilient you are, meaning not just how flexible, but how can you endure this? Because it's going to go on. You're going to have sewagey water in your house probably for weeks. I think one thing that happens, like when I had sort of fairly minor things in Africa when the water was off and so on, and everyone's getting quite desperate about where they were getting their water from, was that you start to do exactly what we train ourselves to do in these sessions, and that is you start living in the moment. Because when you don't have water, you want water now, right? So you're not, in a way, you're living kind of day by day, and you think, solve today's problems. I can't afford to worry about tomorrow or the following week because it's too distant, and I want to survive now. And survival is not just physical survival; it's sort of moral survival as well. The will to go on when things turn really bad. So you find then that you're kind of forced into narrowing down your perspective to be here and now and live more in the moment, or live day by day, as we say. Let's solve this problem. Let's get these sandbags from there over to here. Not shall we do that next week as well, or whatever. Of course, I'm not saying you don't plan to some extent. Endurance often is not having a plan into the future in which we're going to do A, B, and C. It's like just plodding on day after day carrying 3 or 4 sandbags. You know what I mean? So it just goes on and on. But you have to be able to just stay with that day. And that's, I think, an important part of endurance when you're actually in that sort of situation. People who are seriously ill will say the same thing. I'm just living for today. And they're getting a lot of peace in that, just living in that day. Because that's precious, isn't it? That's the day when things have got to be done. That's the day when things count for you, whether you're going to see people that you love or, things are going to happen in such a way that have meaning for your life, as opposed to all the meaningless things that we normally do. Right? Okay, so endurance. The word doer is in there. Duro in Italian, for example, means hard. So endurance means that you've been hardened, that some part of you has been hardened. Does it sound a bit cold or distant to be hardened in this case?
I think it's important, and I like what Andy said about having hope as a key component of endurance. You have to have meaning. You have, if you look at Viktor Frankl's work, if a human being got a reason for something, he can put up with almost anything. So when you say endurance hardening you, I think there's a danger in if you become too hard, because then you're brittle, and then you don't have. It's not strength. It's actually it's almost a handicap, isn't it? If you're too hardened, if you don't have that flexibility that you were talking about before, if you don't have that hope for something better or a reason to go on or to carry on living day to day.
Well, that's there's a negative sense of hardened, which you've hardened your heart. And then you might harden your heart against others, which doesn't help in a community. But if the community is hardening itself to get something done for everyone, that's a more positive notion of heart. But hardening your heart is like, I'm going to survive at any cost, I don't care about anybody else, and it's all rubbish anyway. It's kind of cynicism. There's a kind of a cynicism. And actually, cynicism is one path that a lot of people do take in life. But that does it mean that they're enduring, or does it mean that they're not enduring? If you become very cynical. You all know what I mean by cynical. Would you say, is that a form of endurance, or is that a failure of endurance? It is a hardening, I think, but it's a hardening in the negative sense, because life has gone out of it. Hope has gone out of it. Trust in other people has gone out of it. Your trust in yourself has gone out of it.
Sort of totally removing yourself from the situation.
Sorry, Michael, I couldn't...
Totally removing yourself from the situation.
Yeah. And kind of rejecting everybody else. It's a rejection. Yeah. Okay, so endurance. How do we know whether we have endurance or not? Let's put this differently. It's when one is tested, or when a person is tested, that they can see, they have an opportunity to see themselves in 3D Technicolor. When you're comfortable with lots of taken for grantedness, you don't really know what you're like. Do you know what I mean? Because there's no challenge. We often see this when there's some sort of crisis or emergency, that some people stand out. And you may never have expected that person would stand out in that way, because it's always been hidden, because they've never had to respond to a crisis. But suddenly you see that, wow, this person has really got, leadership qualities that were concealed. So this is an important point. Why we should not be afraid to subject ourselves to some discomfort in life, which is very hard to say to people here in the Western world, because we have very high expectations about comfort. Very high, very high. I mean, I would say, historically and geographically, our expectations of comfort are probably ridiculous.
It's a lie.
right, isn't it? It's not an expectation.
It's a what?
It's a right.
It's a right now, yeah. A right to fly off to Bali every year. Yeah. Or climb somebody's sacred mountain and take all your clothes off as well while you're at it. It's kind of it's like the world is here to be my playground. It's my playground, and I have a right to a playground, and the whole world is my playground. So go anywhere and play in it. This is quite a serious delusion, actually, isn't it? Which can only lead to a lot of pain somewhere along the line. We should learn a bit more to take discomfort and even welcome discomfort as a kind of a lesson, really, as to how things might be. Because look at it this way: you go to a care of the elderly home, and actually you see a lot of suffering, and it's not necessarily physical suffering; it's a lot of mental suffering. And I often think, I may be wrong, but I often think that it's because this person's never prepared themselves for the reality of the end of life, where the body breaks down. And it's not that; it's that things are coming to an end. That there isn't another chance. So you've done what you did, and you might think, why the hell was I doing that for 30 years? It's a pretty painful thought. A feeling that things are over, it's all finished, nobody really cares, my relatives don't visit enough, all this sort of... but you see that what's happened here is that in the Western world we set ourselves up for that sort of suffering because we have high expectations about comfort that go on for years, decades. And then that comes. Now, in other countries where things are not so comfortable, there isn't that, at least there isn't such a strong attachment to that illusion. When it comes to the elderly, I mean, I've seen this many times in Africa, that somebody is towards the end of their life, they're still in the family home, they're still being cared for in the family home. People don't resent that necessarily. Well, some people might, some people can do anything, but on the whole, that's what they expect, and that person doesn't feel rejected. But also, what it means is that their presence is a lesson for everybody. Do you see what I'm saying? That even the children will see, this is what it's like when you get old, even though your mind is going. So it's no surprise when that comes to you. And then, when it comes to you, you can endure. You can endure. I still find some meaning in it all. Of course, if you've been living a chocolate box life, then it's a bit of a shock when it comes to an end. So endurance, well, I was saying two things really. Endurance requires experience or being some preparedness through discomfort, but there's also this thing of who am I actually? How brave am I? Will I run away when I don't know, because I've not experienced that. But then I might be very surprised when the person who'd always been a quiet, mousy person is the one that stands up and gets things done. And it's good to be able to laugh at it. And I think actually humour is an important part of endurance, isn't it? We have to be able to laugh at ourselves, but you see, you need a certain level of awareness and solidity or self-confidence to be able to laugh at yourself without feeling, offended. If others are laughing, you may say, well, okay, I'll laugh along with you because you're right, actually. I know I'm like that. Okay, that's how I am. Let's all laugh together. Again, we're not particularly good at that. Some people are better than others. But you see, it's connected with self-awareness and the sorts of things we're learning from the Buddha Dharma about watching what is going on in that mental space. So after a time, you do start to find a lot of the human condition quite humorously ridiculous. It is such a merry-go-round. And you do find that humour, for example, in Shakespeare and other people. It's tragic, but it's also a tragic comedy. What's a tragic comedy? How can something be a tragedy and a comedy at the same time? Well, it so often is, I'm afraid. Okay, the other dimension that at least I picked out was balance, which I would connect with equanimity. That resilience involves maintaining balance, and that's where the bounce back ability thing comes in. You get knocked this way, but you you go back to the center point, and then you're not that way, and then tilt a bit, come back. So equanimity is the phrase we use most in Buddha Dharma, but again, it's a word that's tended to drop out of our language. Although it's a fine word, and there isn't really a way of replacing that word. You see, because what we're dealing with, the human condition, is a tendency to reactivity. That is, a reactivity lacking any self-awareness. Whereas in equanimity, because you have that extra bit of awareness, then you will be more mentally composed or balanced, or you'll have equanimity. Always come back to the center point. You're not going to be perfect. We're not talking about perfection here. We're just talking about, a shift in one's general, a character shift, I suppose, a shift in one's character. Okay. Now, that equanimity is surely also a part of what it is to be resilient. So, what the Buddha Dharma has to contribute to this discussion about resilience is self-understanding, self-awareness, which also comes through the meditational training. And in most of the sort of psychology-based discussions of resilience, you don't hear very much about that. It's often presented as though, well, if you follow some of these basic rules, you will develop resilience, which may work up to a point. It's often presented as some sort of quick fix. But you see, real resilience, I think, is quite a deep-seated thing if one has self-understanding, that one will generally be more resilient. So you'll have... Well, the other word we could use for it would be something like mental composure. But it doesn't quite catch the sense of equanimity as being able to restore balance whatever happens. And that is the painful aspect of Western society, is that we each want something for ourselves, and we've forgotten maybe how to give. So the result is we don't receive either. And then when we're in need, then we're a little bit disappointed. Where is everybody? Why don't I have any visitors in this hospital bed? Or why don't I have sufficient numbers of visitors in this hospital bed? Which, having been to hospital quite a lot recently, because my mum is there, it's surprising how often people do feel that. And one of the nurses was actually saying to me about some lady, she said, she doesn't get any visitors. So I said, well, maybe there isn't anyone. She said, oh yes, there are, but they don't come. Okay. So there's somebody dying, in their late 80s, no visitors. You can't help thinking, well, if you turn that around, it's not necessarily the fault of the visitors, in a sense. It's kind of the nature of our society. I don't give anything. I'm an individual. I'm thinking of myself. So everyone else is doing the same. So then when I'm then in a situation of total vulnerability, I don't receive anything. Well, surprise, surprise. Why would I receive anything when the nature of our society is to take for oneself rather than to give? I know I'm exaggerating a bit here, but I think you know the point. You can see the point I'm making. Yeah, anybody else got any other...
There's also the issue of not taking life so personally.
Mm-hmm.
And we do take life personally, and if we just accept that we are life, we're living,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to I'm an individual, then if you stand back a bit from that and just accept what comes up, that it's not a personal issue, it's just the way things are.
Yeah. I know what you mean, yeah. It's like identifying, with everything that's going on around you. If you look in the garden, you see how the garden looks in the winter, and then you see it all springing up, it all looks beautiful, and then something starts happening. It starts dying away again, right? But then I've got a tree stump, and I've noticed that there's a huge fungus, yellow fungus, growing on the side of it. Out of death is coming life again. That everything is going through an arising and a falling away. And that is the best way to look at life. And it applies. So as Rod has just said, it's not that I'm a spectator. Life is not a spectator sport. I am life. And it applies to me equally, it applies to everything else around me. So I'm not a spectator watching life, I am life. Of course, I think we're going to have continue the discussion after lunch. We're going to have, of course, another meditation for 1 hour again. Right? This is where we are testing your endurance, your flexibility, and your mental balance. Another hour of sitting there doing nothing. You are doing something, actually. You're meditating.
New Buddha Way lets go of East and West and starts afresh in the life we have now. For more information, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.